Good morning, guys. So this morning we will continue with our lesson on Abram, and it is lesson 7, and we are going to be looking at God's covenant with Abram. So here we're going to be focusing on the promise that God made to Abram, which was what? To be by his side and bless him, right? And here we're going to see that he becomes renamed to Abraham. Some highlights that I would like you to take with this lesson are that here we're going to see the covenant and the royal grant covenant, that are two types of covenants in the Old Testament. And it's called the suzerain vessel covenant and the royal grant covenant. So if you have your notes, write those two covenants down. And the people of the ancient Middle East had specific ceremonies that accompanied making these covenants. And God made both the suzerain vessel and the royal grant covenants with Abram. God kept the covenant promises he made with Abram. All right. So God's covenant here, we can see that his people are very critical at doing these covenants, but are also a very important component in the story of Abram. The covenants follow the forms of agreements that are common at that time. There are two types of forms: an unconditional promise, or a royal grant, and a conditional promise, or a suzerain vessel covenant. So an unconditional promise, or that is the royal grant, and a conditional promise, that is called also a suzerain vessel covenant. The promises studied in this lesson are the unconditional, which are: I will make you great. I will make you a great name. To your descendants, I give this land. However, the covenant in Genesis 17 sets the conditions. Abraham and his descendants must be circumcised as a symbol of their consecration to God. So, we are going to be studying Genesis 15. And before we continue the lesson, to better understand it, go to your books, pages 21 and 22, and read that so that you can be able to understand a little bit more about these covenants. So, a little bit to think. Imagine that you are about to buy a car for somebody. What steps would it take for you to take before you own that vehicle? What do you need to do? So some steps I think that I would do is go to the store, to the different car dealerships, find out the prices, what documents you need to sign, the vehicle's title, then would have to be transferred to another name. Then your license would need to be bought. So there's several steps that you would need to take in order to have a car. So when we buy or sell a car or other large items like houses and other items like that, the government often has a legal way to ensure that each party honors the commitment that has been made. When a smaller item is sold privately, a person's word or his cash is enough to seal the deal. So in Abraham's time, an elaborate sacrifice was made to ensure that both sides kept the agreement. This method of sacrifice is detailed in your text. Okay? So today's lesson focuses on God's agreement or his covenant with Abram. All right? So right now, pause this video and take the time to read those 2 pages. And after you have read them, I hope that you will understand better the different kinds of covenants that we talked about And so have your Bible available so that you can be able to answer the questions later on. So the world of the Old Testament, there was covenants between people and groups of people that were very common. Covenants were ways of ensuring peace, gaining protection, and maintaining a livelihood. The Israelites and their ancient people used three main types of covenants. The first type of covenant was what we had mentioned, the unconditional covenant, or the royal grant covenant. In this covenant, the king gave a servant a special benefit for faithful service. The covenant could include a piece of land, a high position in the king's court, or some other special benefit. The benefit could last forever, but the descendants of the servants would receive the benefit only if they too faithfully served the king. This type of covenant that God made, this is the type of covenant that God made with Abram. The covenant did not depend on Abram, but rather on the King of Kings. In Abram's case, God promised that the covenant would extend to Abram's descendants as well. So look up Genesis chapter 9, verse 8 through 17. And here you can see that there's another example of the royal grant covenant. What promise does God make to Noah and his descendants? Remember when we were studying Noah? That he will never again destroy the world with a flood. What sign or seal did God give Noah that indicated that promise? Do you remember? The rainbow. God said that the rainbow would serve as a sign of the covenant. So what did God ask Noah to do in return? Nothing. He didn't ask Noah to do anything in return. Like the covenant in today's lesson, this was an unconditional covenant. So the second type of covenant we want to look at today is the conditional, or the Caesarean vessel covenant. In this type of covenant, a great king, the Caesarean, made an agreement with one of his subjects, or a lesser king, the vessel. The great king promised to protect and care for the subject king if the subject king would serve only the great king. The covenant was broken only when the lesser king, the vessel, withdrew his loyalty. At that point, the great king no longer protected or cared for that lesser king. So God also made this kind of covenant with Abram. So in Genesis chapter 17, we can see that in this entire passage, God tells Abram that he has changed his name to Abraham. So if you have some time, it would be really wise to read this chapter 17 so that you can understand the name change, okay? Right here, God tells Abram that he has changed his name to Abraham to make sure that all the males in his family and among his servants are circumcised as a sign of their covenant with God. If they are not circumcised, God tells Abraham that they will have broken the covenant and he will be cut off from God's people. So it is pretty strict, that symbol of circumcision. So in Joshua 24, we also see that the people of Israel renew their covenant with God after they had entered the promised land and the land that had been divided among the tribes. So here is another way that we see God renewing his covenant with his people, where Joshua tells the people, what is going to happen to you if you don't faithfully follow God. Do you remember what happened there? Joshua tells them that God will bring disaster upon them if they do not keep their side of the covenant. And what kind of disasters could have that been? Read Joshua 24 to understand that. Why would this renewal of the covenant be considered a Caesarean vessel covenant and not a royal grant covenant? Remember the differences? I hope you're taking your notes. What's the Caesarean vessel covenant and the royal grant? Well, the people were dependent on God to take care of them and bless them in the promised land. The people had to keep their part of the agreement by serving God only, not the idols that the Egyptians had or the Canaanites. If the people served God, He would take care of them. And we saw that over and over. He took care of their needs, and they messed up a lot, and He continued to take care of them, but they did it by offering sacrifices and repenting. So take time now to answer these 5 questions and read each. There's 5 different Bible texts about God's covenant with Abraham. God's covenant with Abraham included the promises of a great nation and land. Look up the following passages and write down how God kept His promises. Look up at the heavens and count the stars. If indeed you can count them, see, so shall your offsprings be. That says it in Genesis 15, which me and you are offsprings of Abraham because we believe in the same God of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Have a blessed weekend, and I look forward to seeing your responses. If you have any questions, please email me.